Last week I spoke about the Exodus and the faithfulness of God through salvation history as the escaped slaves settled in the Promised Land. Leadership of the people evolved from charismatic personalities like Moses and Joshua and those called judges to a desire to be like the other nations and have a king. Samuel, who responded to God's call when a child, marks the transition from judge and priest to king. It is he who anoints the first king, Saul, who turned out to be a failure, and the second, David. Despite David's roving eye, think Bathsheba, 1,000 years later, David has become so important in the story of God's people that the one called Messiah, another Saviour, would be seen as his successor. This period of Israel's life is largely told in the so-called historical books of 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. Solomon takes over from David, and at least in the eyes of the biblical writers, is renowned across the world for his wealth and wisdom. The truth is possibly somewhat different. Much of the good work done by David in uniting the people is undone and then collapses under Solomon and his successors. The kingdom which David put together splits into two. Israel, focused on Samaria and Shechem in the north, Judah, focused on Jerusalem to the south. The story of God's people for some centuries, roughly between 1000 BC and 600 BC, is told largely through the faithfulness or not of the kings to God. So-and-so sinned in the eyes of the Lord is the sad refrain that is repeated over and over again. In the 8th century before Christ, society became more prosperous and the wealth of some grew. The positive side of this was probably that things like writing, scholarship, and architecture began to flourish, while the gap between the haves and the have-nots grew ever wider. Into this situation came a new breed of leaders, those people known as the prophets. Hosea and Amos introduced an ethical dimension to being followers of God. It was not enough simply to go through the correct religious motions, saying prayers, going to the temple, offering sacrifices. The prophet Micah sums it up well when, having made clear that the outward trappings of religion are not what God requires, he offers these words. What does the Lord require? Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. The prophets were not primarily about looking to the future. That's a very contemporary sort of understanding, but of calling the people back to the fundamentals of living as God required, according to the ancient covenant established under Abraham and expanded with Moses and the 10 Commandments. Sadly, not even the prophets could prevail, and the second great E word comes into the story, exile. The Babylonians swept across Jerusalem, looting, burning, and killing, and taking a number of people into exile. Psalm 137, with its opening words, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept," reflects this terrible time. Eventually, that led to reshaping and retelling the story of God's salvation and the people of Israel as they began to look forward to a Saviour, one called the Messiah.